Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we have our econ show, and we have a lot to cover, but I think I consolidated it into things that matter the most, and trying to show, where are we progressing, and really honing in on the data that's going to drive us going forward, because there's a lot of stuff out there and there's a lot of moving parts. And the puzzle's complicated, and it's one of the things where I just did a segment with Open Exchange TV with Gary Brode, and we were discussing what's happening with central banks, and one of the key topics was Japan. And the reason why we focus so much on Japan is because they are a very pivotal part of the global economy, and we're gonna really kind of work that into where we sit right now and why there's going to be so much pressure, especially as we start talking about the Fed and what the Fed decided to do with increasing rates by 75 basis points and another increase that is likely coming next month. Now, when we look at the different segments, the first segment's going to look at some of the key leading indicators that are showing how is 2023 starting to look. What are the leading indicators showing us? Then we're going to go into how the Fed meeting shows no pivot. It could be a slowdown in terms of what the rates are going forward, but we're not going to get this magical pivot of an all stop. Then we want to go through some of the regional Fed data and some of the importance behind that. Then we're going to look at the ECB and how they are going to try to address, I guess, inflation at this point. And then wrapping up with the new Chinese data that's showing that contraction is picking up steam. And then next week, we're going to go a bit deeper into the CCP's Congress. But it takes time for them to disseminate, because they really start to hone in and refine what they're going or how they're going to implement policy, because they'll talk about the policy on a very, very high level, 50, 60,000 foot level. And then over the coming, let's call it the next 6 to 10 weeks, they'll start to put out how they're going to implement that policy over time. So some of the key things here at this point is the new export orders. And new export orders is a great leading indicator of where things are going to come from in general. So when you look at the new export orders, you can see Japan is still fairly flat. We're starting to see that roll over a bit more aggressive back on what we've seen in general in terms of the shortage, with Masrick coming out saying that they're reducing global trade flows by 2 to 4%. That's only going to get worse. And the problem with Japan is it's such an integral part of the tech supply chain. So when you look at the flows of their importers of semi-finished goods, some raw material, a lot of raw materials from an energy perspective, but a lot of semi-finished goods, they assemble and then export. So if Japan struggles the way it's already struggling, there's a huge knock-on effect to the backside of how their supply chain looks. And that bleeds down into China, into South Korea, other Asian nations, and as well as into other developed markets. But then when you look at other key exporting nations, especially Germany, you get an idea of how that is getting worse. And now the ECB has come out and said that base case is a recession going into 2023. And at the same time, they've also said rates have to go higher. So the problem is, typically, when you're going into a recession, you reduce rates to try to incentivize borrowing, make things a bit cheaper, help the economy, try to bolster itself. And because they've waited so long, and it's not just the ECB, but other banks, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how we're in this period of just pressure that is not going anywhere fast. So global recession, German new export orders are now below their COVID lows, which is this is about weak global demand since it's about export orders. This metric is also tumbling for the US, the UK. Only place holding up is Japan, given the weak yen, but that is starting to roll over. When you start looking at Asian currencies versus USD, you get manufacturing PMI and new export orders. And when you look at those flow downs in general, we're getting a huge drop, which is only accelerating when you start looking at the new export orders coming up, where manufacturing PMI is going through. And that's where, when you start putting it into the context of Asian currencies and the US dollar, you get an idea of just how much pressure that is coming under. And when we'll talk about this again in segment 3 as well, when you look at the U.S. consumer, the largest buyer in the world, as we slow and as global trade slows, Asian markets rely significantly on that export flow, and without it, you're going to get more pressure. So then when we go to the next level of global growth indicators are plunging, again, the global manufacturing PMI, new export orders, German manufacturing PMI for new export orders, Korean manufacturing PMI, all of which are now steeply in contraction. Then you look at the U.S. in terms of new orders versus inventories, also coming into contraction. The Euro area, new orders versus inventories. Again, all of these key components are showing you the direction that we're heading in. And again, nothing falls in a straight line. As my old boss used to say, nothing dies in a straight line, but look for direction. Look to where is the trend. And this is just showing you the trend. The trend is not flat. It's not up. It's down. The trend is down, and it takes time for that to work through the system. And that's why when you look into Q4 and beyond, we see additional pressure points that are mounting. JP Morgan's global manufacturing PMI fully now in contraction. And as we've been highlighting from the beginning, intermediate goods are the most important ones to watch, because that is where a lot of big countries sit in, because they bring in the semi-finished products, they bring in the raw materials, they assemble it and kick it forward. And as Japan slows, South Korea slows, China slows, they're no longer buying the intermediate goods. That's where you're going to see the first kind of drop, because those orders are dropping. Japan, like Toyota, Honda, other big entities are not ordering the same amount of those intermediate pieces that are going to be assembled into the final product, showing that pressure to the downside. And that's where you look at global manufacturing new orders contracting, continuing to show a lot of that pressure and moving down in a faster light. Now, rising rates will also weigh on the developed economies' housing markets. Some of the key pieces that we've talked about with housing is the change in real home prices. And you can see that even though the U.S. is obviously elevated, as we've talked about numerous times, it's not the highest in the world. And it's not the highest in the world on many levels in terms of change in real home prices, price to income, price to rent. We are just we're elevated and in a poor position, but by no means the worst. Now, the other issue is New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the UK to a degree was a great place for Chinese entities to launder money when you had a massive buying of property and of land and homes. That is now ending. So when you look at the new flows of who is your new incremental buyer, they don't exist. Now you have rates going up exponentially, and it's important because people, how they feel in terms of wealth, in terms of what their buying power is typically very much driven to what their home prices are. And as that continues to not only roll over, but now firmly reverse, that's going to put more pressure on the underlying system. Global PMI versus global monetary policy. So as monetary policy continues to tighten, again, that's going to pull down those PMIs. And when you look at global short rates on a tear higher, the percentage of world central banks hiking rates, we're coming up to 70%. So we have a massive amount of tightening happening in the face of this crazy increase in inflation. And typically as you get inflation, you get a slowdown in buying. But as demand slows, you have that supply slowing as well, which is breeding that underlying stagflation that we've talked so much about. So then when you start looking at some of the key bellwethers, especially in the Eastern European and Western European fronts, you can get an idea that it's not just Germany, it's not just Japan, it's not just some of these other entities, but all countries are seeing new PMI orders minus inventories and the underlying PMIs moving into a contractionary period, which is echoed again with the manufacturing PMI that we've seen on the right, in terms of the world is now negative, and India was the kind of the last bastion of growth, which is what we see actually starting to get a bit worse as we progress through the remainder of this quarter. And then copper production is important because I was talking to my friend Matthew Warder, and he was giving me a breakdown of the LME conference he was in London. He was in London, and he went through. He's like, miners don't know what to mine because they're not getting orders, because the people who would be giving the orders on copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel are waiting to understand, well, what kind of government subsidies am I going to get? And that's going to help me define what my demand's going to look like. And without that, you have essentially both sides looking across the table of the suppliers and the demand sector and going, I don't know what to tell you. And the problem is, copper production it's not just you or any production from that perspective. You don't just flip on a switch. You have to get people and trucks and more importantly, diesel and other input costs to make sure that you can actually power the economy. And that's what we're not seeing. And that's going to create some of these shortfalls that we continue to see in general. Then when you take it to the next level and look at trucking, so when we just look at the U.S., today's National Truckload Index dropped to a new cycle low of $1.74 a mile, down 4 cents. And again, this is where we're starting to see guys operate in the red. With rates falling so quickly in the last week, the 7-day doesn't tell the whole story. Rates have fallen from $1.77 to $1.67 net of fuel. And this October was the worst month for carriers this year, and we haven't seen anything get better. It's only gotten worse so far to kick off November, which is why, if you remember, we talked about how we were getting really bearish in July of 19 and how that continued into the end of the year. And you can see we're getting to the same point we were at in terms of the rejections, in terms of trucking, and that is giving us the same concern, the same pause. And then when you look at the petchem facilities and the petchem companies in their announcements, it continues to worsen. U.S. Drought Monitor, this is October 25th. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten any better, where you see that the amount of drought has continued to grow. And this has created, it's still early, but the worst winter wheat crop so far in history. And again, it just continues to follow on the pressure points that we're seeing, the issues that we're seeing, where nothing is actually improving on the food front. And we've already whittled down supply. We've already whittled down the storage, the excess storage capacity, and we are really relying on some big bumper crops, and we're just not getting them. We're not only not getting bumper crops, we're not even getting normal crop levels, and that is creating that underlying struggle that is not improving anywhere. And then this is why the Ukraine crop exports are so important, because the monthly shipments surged since the grain corridor opened in August. But then you had Russia talk about, well, we're going to close it. Oh no, we're going to allow it, but we may not renew it. And the uncertainty is just everybody is relying on this additional crop coming out. But then, given the war that continues to rage between Ukraine and Russia on Ukrainian soil, what is the likelihood that they're going to get the right nutrients, the right seeds, the ability to till the land, grow the land, really any ability to continue to drive growth and to maintain their export levels? And it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to do that. So another key thing that we've talked about on multiple occasions is the water stress and the freshwater stress. And this is an older data set, but it still rings true in terms of the pressures that we're seeing in terms of internal resource losses. And when you look at the crop side and you look at the droughts that have continued to hit and the use of synthetic fertilizers, you can see that this is going to create additional problems, because the water stress is causing the deterioration of freshwater resources, which are needed for crop growth and for normal irrigation and best practices, which is also impacting those yields. Then when you look at the FX headwinds, which are continuing to mount with, again, the dollar coming back to 113, which is a fairly comfortable spot that we see the market sitting in, it's no surprise, but the stories containing FX headwinds are showing up at the second fastest rate since 2015, which is when the dollar had seen a 27% advance. And we just see a lot of staying power in the dollar here, a likely move to about 115, which again is going to continue to put that stress on not only Asian and foreign currencies, but also on their underlying debt that is denominated in dollars, and or they have to try to struggle because as exports slow, their natural way of repatriating dollars back into their country is diminished, and that's pulling down those FX reserves that they need so badly to try to maintain general operation and defend against the inflation that we continue to see. So that's what we have for you on the global side. The next segment, we're going to go deeper into the U.S. and what is happening on that front.